Let's see. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. Hi, everybody. We're going to wait just another second for a few last-minute people to join us, and then we'll hear from Liam then. So hold on, just one more minute. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is How to Have Your Cake and Eat It Too, Managing Software Development in a High Compliance Environment. Presentation that's going to be given by Liam Haimovitch, who's the CTO at Rookout. My name is Daniel Spoonhauer, or Spoons. I'm the chief architect and a co-founder at Lightstep. And I'm excited for all of you to be here today, and I'm excited to hear Liam's talk. SOC 2 is something that we've gone through here at Lightstep, something that I played a big role in, and something that I learned about in the process as well. I'm also a big fan of automating things, of DevOps, and so I'm really excited to see what Liam has to say about this. Just a quick couple of bookkeeping things before we get started. Today's talk is recorded, and so everyone that signed up and registered will get a link to the recording afterward. It's something you can share out with other folks in your organization, colleagues, friends. And secondly, if you have any questions, we'll save some time at the end to answer those. So you can use the Q&A feature that's down somewhere at the bottom of the screen, probably down here somewhere. Looking forward to having some discussion afterward. And like I said, I'm looking forward to Liam's talk. So with that, go ahead. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So hey, everybody. It's great being here. And today I'll be speaking about compliance, especially how do you develop software in a compliance environment, and how can you reconcile the need for security and especially the need for compliance against the need for DevOps, for the cultures you are trying to build, for the velocity, for the quality, for the agileness. How can you go about achieving the both of them? So let me quickly share my screen. And I hope all of you can see it now. And so managing software in a high compliance environment. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about today. So just a brief introduction of myself. As Daniel mentioned, my name is Liam Haimovitch, and I'm the co-founder and CTO of Rookout. I'm an advocate of modern software methodologies. I've been speaking and writing a lot about agile and DevOps, microservices, Kubernetes, the cloud, CI/CD, and so on and so forth. Now, before founding Rookout, I spent about a decade doing cybersecurity work as a researcher, as a developer, as a product manager. And so I came with a very strong background in cybersecurity. And in some way, it prepared me to being the CTO, to being the acting CISO. But in other ways, it didn't prepare me at all. And here are some of the compliances we've gone through at Rookout. We've gone through HIPAA, we've gone through SOC 2 Type 2, we've gone through ISO 27001, and we've gone through GDPR and CCPA, and we're actually going through a few more processes right now as we speak. Now, if this was a live talk, if we were in an audience, I would probably have asked you some questions, which are kind of hard to do in this format of webinars. It's not nearly as much fun, but I do want you to take a second and think through it. What kind of compliances are you interested in? Are you looking for SOC 2 or ISO? Are you looking more at the privacy focused stuff such as GDPR or HIPAA? And much of it depends on the type of the company you're working for. Is it a B2B company or a B2C company? Are you a small startup or a services company, or are you a very large enterprise or somewhere in between? And all of those questions make a huge impact into the type of compliances we're trying to achieve. And yet, in many ways, they all end up doing pretty much the same. Now, going back to Rookout, the reason we've gone through all those certifications in a matter of 2 or even 3 years is because of the type of the product we're building. Rookout allows our customers to deploy us in their cloud environments or even in their on-prem environments and essentially extract data from any environment on the fly using Rookout. And so essentially you can debug your code anywhere, you can resolve customer issues so much faster, but in a way you're granting Rookout at least some access to your production environments so that we may serve you. Now, obviously that requires a significant amount of trust. And this is why we've invested so much time and effort into compliance, into security, and all the aspects of that. And so I want to share with you that journey, how we've gone about doing that, how can you do it too, and essentially it's how to have your cake and eat it too. Now let me take you back about 3 years to a conversation I had with my head of DevOps at the time. This was just after one of our first board meetings after being funded, and we already had a pretty good product. It was working, it was fun, and it was a tough sale. And the number one concerns we were hearing at the time about why can you sell your product, and if any of your entrepreneurs, you know that that's always what you're hearing. Why somebody can't buy your product, and then you have to learn from it and see about improving it. So the number one concern we were hearing at the time was security. And we tried to figure out how can we prove we're secure? How can we go through this objection? How can we get people to trust us? And one of the first things that came to mind is SOC 2. Now, SOC 2 is the most common compliance for general purpose security in the US. It's part of the American Association of Certified Public Accountants, or AACPA. And it's about how do you govern your IT policies end to end. Now, in that conversation with my head of DevOps, I was telling him we've just made a decision to go ahead and adopt SOC 2 in the hope that it's going to make us improve our security posture and makes the sales process much easier. And so he shared with me his story that at his previous role, as the company was working for was undergoing SOC 2, things became unbearable for the engineers. They just couldn't do any work. It became very frustrating, and he almost quit his job. And that's not the most encouraging story you want to hear as you're about to embark on a compliance journey, especially not with the person who's supposed to be leading that journey with you. And so we've gone around, we've met multiple heads of security and heads of engineering, and we learned about their journey, their ups and downs, and how they handled compliance. And we ended up achieving that SOC 2 compliance in under 6 months. And we've also added a whole bunch of other compliances, as you've seen along the way. And that's what you have to think about. How can you achieve that in a fast and clear manner? How can you do it with the way you're working currently, rather than forcing some archaic rules and regulations on you? Now, I love this quote by Nicole team from the State of the DevOps report before she went over from Google to Microsoft. And this quote says, our own research has found that an organizational culture that optimizes for information flow, trust, innovation, and risk sharing is predictive of software development organizational performance. Now, of course, we all want our software development teams to perform well. And what Nicole is saying here, you have to build trust. And trust is super important. It's a key factor for DevOps, and it's a key factor of most successful organizational cultures. And at the same time, take a look at this quote from Reed Deshler from Align Org Solution. And he's saying in business, we often use the more politically astute term governance instead of control. Now, if you click that link at the bottom and you go ahead and read it, you will actually learn that there is a clear difference between governance and control. And while control is definitely a form of governance, quite often the easiest and most approachable form of governance, there are other approaches. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. What we want to do is to achieve governance without achieving control. We want our software engineers to feel empowered. We want them to feel trusted. We want to give them as many tools as they can to do their jobs. We want to give them the ability to move forward, while at the same time, we have to govern. Whether we're CTOs or VP of engineering or chief security officers or other leaders within the organizations, we have to build that governance, not only for the sake of engineering, but that governance is necessary for the organization as a whole. It's necessary for a company to go public. It's necessary for a company to work with regulators, to work with customers, and so on and so forth. So we need to figure out that approach. We need to make it work for us. And here I've taken this diagram from the See the Whole blog, and this is a set of DevOps principles. Here you can see 6 primary ones, and there are actually quite a few diagrams out there of the principles of DevOps. I haven't managed to find one that's agreed to everyone. And you can see that on the one hand, we definitely have stuff like the social aspects uh, and the sharing that are all about trust and openness and stuff that's important for us. But we also have stuff that's very actually works very well with governance, whether it's about measurement. The more you measure, obviously, the more you know, the more you're in governance, the more you quality assure, the more you automate. There are many ways within the principles of DevOps that lead to, to governance. And by building on those principles of DevOps, we can actually build a fully governed operation that's working with DevOps. Now, how do you go do about that? This is my own personal little framework for how do you implement governance by DevOps, especially if you are already working in a DevOps manner. So for each governance requirement, and if you're going through a governance process, whether through a outside regulation or through a customer, you're going to get a very, very long list of requirements. So think through each and every one of those requirements. Is this requirement, is this risk currently being met through an existing DevOps process? For instance, you will find that many governance requirements, such as reviews, can be automatically handled through pull requests and GitOps, which we're going to discuss in a bit. And if that's the case, then that's awesome. I'm already meeting this requirement through an existing DevOps process. So all I have to do is go ahead and document it. I can mark off that checkbox and say, yeah, that's managed through this process. On the other option, you can say, no, this requirement is not currently being met. Now, as you all know, DevOps is all about continuous learning. And what you should be thinking of this compliance process is as a learning opportunity. Now, somebody, potentially an expert or a group of experts, have just pointed out that this is a potential risk, potentially a very important risk, and you're now saying, I'm not meeting that risk. Well, maybe that risk is truly important. Maybe this poses a significant risk to your business, to your operation, to your customers. Maybe you don't have access controls that are rigid enough or that are clear enough or that are strict enough. And if that's a real risk, then you should go ahead and meet that risk and you should elevate it. But you should do it the DevOps way. Go about automating it, go about empowering it, but do go about it. And once you've met that risk in the DevOps way, in the way that you prefer to meet that risk, you can just go ahead, check that box, and document it and move on. And sometimes you'll find that you think that the compliance is wrong. You think that the compliance is overreaching. You think that this risk is not applicable. And so you can often document it and you can actually quite often get away with it by documenting it. If you have a very good explanation about why this risk is manageable, you'll often be able to convince your management, your leadership, as well as your auditors that this risk is acceptable and you don't have to do it. In a way, compliance and governance is very much about documenting what risks you meet and what risks you don't meet and why. And so you'll be surprised at how much you can achieve by building on DevOps and changing very little at all about what you're doing if you are following DevOps best practices such as automation, GitOps, quality, automated testing, and so on. Now, at Rookout, we've actually ended up building on three main pillars of DevOps, three main processes of DevOps or perspectives of DevOps to baking that compliance into our processes. And the first of those pillars is automation. Now, obviously, here we're all about DevOps and automation. So there are many ways to many values to automation. It's gonna get you more consistent product. It's gonna get you to reduce toil. It's gonna make your engineers happier, and so on and so forth. But here, when we think about the value of automation for compliance, it's about how can we better govern. And obviously, somebody SSHing into a Linux machine or somebody connecting directly into a database to carry out a general purpose maintenance work, that's a huge risk. That's a huge gap. That's something we have very little governance on. Well, even though regardless of how much we trust that person, we can't prove neither to ourselves, nor to our leadership, and definitely not to our auditors and clients that that person is only doing what he's supposed to be doing as part of his job. And so that puts us in a problem. On the other hand, if we're doing that maintenance work, that backup through a script, then that's much easier to prove what's going on because that script offers logs. That script is source code. You can show this is what is happening. And it's much easier to govern over automated process than over manual processes. And to do that, I recommend going through the following approach. Build a portal. At Rookout, our main portal is just a Jenkins master, but you can also use GitHub Actions. You can use other CI tools and other portals as well. And go ahead and fill that portals with all the scripts and all the tasks you want to achieve, whether it's CI/CD or backups or restores or whatever. And then go ahead and give each employee permissions to that portal based on his needs, so that each of them can do whatever tasks are needed to be done from his perspective. Now, this portal, once you can initiate the scripts, whether they're automated based on time or through an employee request, those scripts directly access your production and other environments, and they make whatever changes are needed. And you have full auditing over what's going on, who logs in, who executes what, and what changes are being made. And best of all, this means you don't have to give your employees SSH access or administrator access or any privileges to production. Obviously, you're still going to have some operations people, some engineers who do have access to production, but you'll find that they have much fewer of them. And here we come to the principle of least privilege. And when it comes to automation, for security, it's all about the principle of least privileges. So here are a few tasks you can automate: deployment and releases, provisioning and deprovisioning of environments, system and integration tests, maintenance and cleanups, and obviously backups and restores. Now, when you're trying to figure out what to automate first, what's the most important, if we were thinking of DevOps in general, we would be trying to automate what's happening the most, or what carries the most risk for a malfunction, and so on. From a security perspective, our most immediate concern is the principle of least privilege. We want to give our engineers as little privileges as possible to simplify our governance. So if, for instance, there are tasks that everybody who gets an on-call duty has to do, we want to automate those tasks. Because if there are tasks that require significant privileges, for instance, there might be a very simple task about, getting a record from a database, or checking the number of cells in the table. And by automating that task, we can avoid giving database access to many engineers. And that's a great task to automate because we're cutting back on privileges. And we can prove to our auditors we don't have as many people accessing production. So now, following automation, the second pillar we believe strongly in is CI/CD and GitOps. Now, I've already mentioned that earlier, but I want to go deeper. I'm not going to go too deep into, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery of software. You build your code, you test it, you release it, and go back again. Very straightforward, but from a governance perspective, this provides us with a very clearly defined process that has a lot of built-in controls, that's highly automated, that's highly regulated, and we can bake as many governance controls as we need directly into this process. There are many security benefits from that. We get a single source of truth. We know where all of our configuration lies in Git. We shift left as much of the responsibility onto the developers themselves. They can do as much as they want on their own. We are building onto an existing process of pull requests. Pull requests or merge requests, if you're a GitLab user, have many built-in gates. You can run unit tests, you can run end-to-end tests, you can scan the source code for dependency vulnerabilities, you can have code reviews, you can build as many safeties as you want directly into the process, and your engineers are already familiar with it. And by building on existing work processes and controls, you're minimizing the change, you're minimizing the disruption for your employees, and you're making things much easier for everyone. And you get built-in auditing. You can know who opened the pull request, what did it contain, when was it merged, when was this deployed to production, when was this tested, and so on and so forth. And so you can essentially build in directly into your security process, directly into your deployment processes, every requirement. Whenever you get a new requirement that has to take place before code is deployed to production, before new code is deployed to production, whenever you get a new requirement about a feature or a task or something that has to go before a configuration change goes in, you can build it into that process. And then you can easily meet those requirements. And quite often, your engineers don't even have to know about it. Quite often you can add an extra step. And if it's simple enough, it can be transparent. And it keeps everybody much happier. Now, the last of the three pillars we've focused on in Rookout is monitoring and observability. And of course, at a Lightstep event, that's the obvious. Monitoring and observability are very important. And the thing is, one of the main reasons people have to go poking around in production is when things go wrong. When a system is down, when a customer reports a bug, when something is unclear, or when quite often even when stuff are clear, then all of a sudden we need to access production to get the data. We need to solve those problems, to report to our leaders and so on. And in a way, after we've spent so much time automating away, giving machines control over what's going on in production to ensure governance, now we're potentially poking new holes into it. And that's not what we want. We want our team, we want our engineers, we want everybody to be able to get the data they need without going directly to production, so they don't endanger the system, they don't present new risks, and they don't hurt our governance. Now, there are many business units who need observability. Obviously, starting with the business, sales and marketing need to know what's going on, how many new signups do you have, how are we selling, and so on and so forth. Product and UX are looking for user feedback. How is the product being used? Why is it being used like that? Ops and security wants to make sure everything is up and running. And we also have the developers. And from my experience, we found that developers tend to be the most problematic of the bunch. Unlike the other three groups, their data requirements tend to shift on a daily basis. And so they are constantly pushing for new data requirements, and they're constantly trying to answer new questions and get more data to answer those questions. And that quite often can be a bit of a challenge from a security perspective. And so we highly recommend to build as strong observability stack as you can so that you have the data you need when you need it. So you should take a look at obviously APM and observability tooling. You should take a look at logging. You should take a look at error tracking and exception catching, as well as business intelligence tooling. And the more first, I can say that from my personal perspective, my personal experience, every time we've added another monitoring tool, we felt it was the right decision. And quite often we felt we made it too late. And I highly recommend the more you can monitor, the better you're going to be. And the easier it's going to be. And you won't find as many people poking around production just to get the data. And additionally, at Rookout, we also obviously use Rookout internally. And Rookout allows engineers to collect the data they need on the fly without having to pre-plan for it or add those log statements and spans ahead of time. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into it. Obviously, I'm sure there are other talks about observability in this forum, but just to give you my 2 cents, I strongly believe you have to mix and match tooling today. There aren't no vendor out there yet has a strong enough tooling that's going to cover all your bases. So you should go ahead and mix and match. You should combine off the shelf, both commercial and open source software, as well as do it yourself. Implement very little, truly what you need, truly what's out there, but you're probably going to find that some of that is necessary. Now, that's an important tip. Redact data. I mean, after all this time we've spent around keeping your production secure, keeping the wrong hand off it, the last thing you want is to inadvertently send out sensitive data from your production through those observability tooling. So make sure to delete, to remove, to clean the data before you send it out. And last but not least, run retrospectives. But whenever you have an incident, whenever you need data, I hate to say it, whenever people push logs or push spans to production just to collect more data, think through it, have a retrospective, and figure out how can you do it better so that next time you're going to have better observability. Do you need more tooling? Do you need more logging? Whatever it is you need to iteratively improve your observability, and so that you're going to have the data you need in a safe and secure manner. So that's all I had for today. Thank you very much. I would love to hear questions.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. That was really cool. Let's see. So I had actually one question I wanted to start with, just talking about observability, obviously something really close to my heart. You talked about sort of data shifts in terms of what engineers are asking for. I wondered if you could just dive in a little bit more about the kind of thing that you were thinking about there.
Of course. So what we've seen is that when observability is quite often discussed in the perspective of SREs and operations, which tend to a certain degree ask the same questions day in and day out. Is my system up and running? How many endpoints do I have? What's the latency for each endpoint? What's the error rate for each endpoint? What's the request per second for each endpoint? Now, I'm not saying those questions are simple, far from it. Those questions can often get quite complex, especially as you're going to larger and more complex systems. But with developers, those questions tend to be even more problematic because their day-to-day responsibilities are shifting very rapidly. I mean, on Monday, you might be getting the ticket to fix a bug for a specific customer. On Tuesday, you might be getting a bug to fix an entirely different bug for an entirely different customer in a different code base. Then on Wednesday, you are getting a ticket to add a feature in a certain area of the code, which you're not familiar with and you're trying to learn about it. And then on Thursday, you are all of a sudden getting a ticket to add analytics to a different part of the code. And so every day of the week, you might be asking yourselves about different parts of the code. Sometimes you might be wondering about performance. How long does a function take? Other times you might be wondering about the types of the inputs. Is this function receiving integers or strings in production, especially if you're working with dynamic typing? Uh, you might be wondering who is calling that function. And those questions are changing much more rapidly, and they tend to be much deeper into the business logic. And so we find that using static logging and static spans often requires you to constantly redeploy and re-add logs, or as we sometimes see customers do, they just make educated guesses and move on, which is less than ideal because sometimes they're over engineering because they don't have the data. Sometimes they're making the wrong assumptions and they have to go back and fix them. And that's kind of
Yeah.
those are my thoughts on
I
that.
see. So it's really that they're just interested in lots of different kinds of behavior of the code, not just the sort of external behavior that
Yeah.
you might think about in terms of something like latency. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question was, you talked about GitOps and using sort of version control as a way of implementing change management for the software. What about for changes that are not to the software itself, right? Changes to the infrastructure or uh, an example of this that I was thinking of was like, once in a while, someone has to go manually update something in a relational database. You didn't ever build the functionality into the product, say, but you just know this one-liner is going to fix the problem. How do you think about that within this kind of controlled environment?
So again, it's kind of a game of risk, and oddly enough, it's quite often a game of documentation. And sometimes if you I've quite often found when it comes to compliance that if you just write something down and share it with enough people, then it's acceptable. Sometimes I was shocked by it, but obviously in every system, something have to be done manually. Some things don't make sense to automate because it's going to be too costly, or it's going to be too complex, or it's just not going to be fast enough. And you're definitely going to have times when somebody logs into to your production, somebody cube cuttles their way into your Kubernetes cluster or whatnot, because sometimes, just with a single line of code, whether it's SQL or CLI or whatever, you can fix a problem that otherwise would take you a week to solve. And that's completely acceptable. At the same time, you have to think through through who is doing that and how are they doing it. How many people do you provide access? Which control protocols are they using? Obviously, SSH is a good option, but other options might not be so good. Are you using multi-factor authentication? Do you keep audit logs? Do you require additional approvals for those kind of access? Do you have separation of duties? Now, based on the level of sensitivity, based on the size of the organization, you may find yourself adding more and more controls over each one of those uh, uh, unique events when somebody gets to log in directly. And what we're often seeing in larger organizations, in more compliant organizations, is that it becomes ever more complex and ever more expensive to keep using those controls as you layer on more and more security.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking a bit about these sort of kind of escape hatches and like how far do you go in automating things or in providing, like you described, a kind of a gateway or a portal, I think, as a way of accessing production. Do you, I guess maybe it's a similar kind of answer that you just think about things like documentation and approvals for how to provide that kind of escape hatch. I'm just thinking of cases where, at some point an engineer had to go and like do some kernel debugging to try and understand, why some particular memory settings were, causing good behavior and bad behavior in different configurations.
Yeah, so it's pretty much all about that. We're seeing that in some customers we're using actually grant access on a per case by case basis, sometimes temporal access. So for instance, some engineer is working on kernel debugging in the Kubernetes cluster to better understand networking. So you can, for instance, give him document that you're giving him access for a week to debug that specific problem. for that reason. And maybe you're using other controls, such as using DLP to prevent data being taken out from that environment. You maybe have additional procedures for that. And at the same time, there are always going to be direct access and manual access, and there are always good reasons for that. But the more we can narrow it down, the easier it's going to be for all of us to prove that we know what's going on. Because if you're going to send your engineers kernel debugging in production every day of the week, then it's going to be pretty hard to ensure what they're doing and why they're doing it, and that it's all uh, based on your policies and procedures and requirements.
Yeah. You mentioned separation of duties. In DevOps, though, we often talk about individual teams being responsible for services in production. How do you make those two things, well, kind of jive, I guess?
So that's a good question. Separation of duties is a very broad concept, and there are actually many ways to look at it. One of them might be actually separation of duties between man and machine. In many cases, surprisingly enough, that actually counts in many cases. You have the person define what has to be done, and then you have a machine or a Jenkins script or whatever carry out that task, and that's its own set of separation of duties. Another example might be just two team members, whether they have different roles or even if they have the same role, that they have to improve each other. And obviously, in larger organizations, there's quite often policies that are being defined through centers of excellence, security teams, or whatnot. And those broader teams define the default. So, for instance, you might be getting a set of tooling you're supposed to use, or a set of set of best practices that are enforced through various tooling. And then you are already operating under a predefined set of policies. That's also a type of separation of duties.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like in my experience, like that definitely is like explaining that kind of thing to an auditor was a big part of the SOC 2 audit, and helping them to kind of understand how we had divided responsibility in these ways. I feel like the other big part of
Sorry about.
You back? Okay, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry
Okay,
about
cool.
that.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, I had one more question, unless anyone else had a question, but maybe I'll ask mine, and someone else can put one into the Q&A. I was thinking a little bit just about how, I mean, there's obviously one way of measuring success if you're going through a compliance exercise, which is, did you get a good grade on the report or not? But I was kind of thinking about how we measure success generally in DevOps, and thinking about, whether it's the number of releases or the sort of age of the code before it's released or something like that. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of how do you measure success, thinking about security and compliance in a DevOps way, and how can we provide goals to teams to actually work towards that more independently?
Yeah. So I touched a bit on that early in the beginning about your motivation.
Yeah.
I can say that for a B2B company, especially smaller B2B companies, from my experience, we are mostly driven by our customers. Especially today, our customers, especially if you're working with enterprise customers, they have very high standards for security. Some of them are due to regulation, some of them are internal, but whatever it is, they place on us a very high burden of security, and that's the bar we have to meet. If you are working in a B2C company, then that's often more directly working with regulators. And obviously, for some larger organizations or some more unique organizations have their own drivers for security, but I see that today, for many companies, most companies, the drivers are external. And so in a way, you get a very clear bar. This is what the business requires for you to sell, to do your job. And so on the one hand, we have a very clear bar. This is the level of security we have to achieve. And on the other hand, we need to see the impact on our engineers. How are they are we keeping their motivation? Are we keeping the culture we need? how is the velocity and quality in other aspects regardless of security. And if we see that we're keeping all of those up to speed and we're keeping all of those as we wish them to be, if our engineers are highly motivated and delivering high quality code fast, then we can understand that security is not negatively impacting them. At the same time, we have to remember that security is a non-functional requirement, just like availability, just like performance, and all non-functional requirements have a cost. They always do, they always will. Security is not free. And as we strive to build a more secure product, we are by definition going to be moving a bit slower because we have more to do, we have more to keep track of. And that's a trade-off we have to make for obviously some fields of business, some customers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I think of availability, maybe I'm wrong for thinking this way, but thinking about reliability and availability a little bit differently, because we might not shoot for 100% there. And I think many of the users that I've worked with, many of the customers that I've worked with are actually totally fine with not hitting 100%. For security, it sounds a little bit harder. Maybe my users aren't as enlightened to think that that we should hit 100% for security. But I was just thinking about something like an error budget and how that could help kind of help us understand trade-offs and make decisions.
I would hate to say that we have an error budget for security, but think of it more of as a risk mitigation.
Yeah.
And there are certain risks that we can't meet all the risks out there. We never can, we never will. And there are going to be some risks we can't mitigate against. And I would say that very few, but the most mature organizations when it comes to security understand that you can't protect from everything all the time, just like you can't have 100% availability. And in fact, for most companies, I would say 3 nines is by itself more than enough. And the same goes for security.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. All right, I don't see any more questions, so so we'll wrap things up. I want to thank Liam. That was a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Some things that I think I'm going to take back and talk to our team about. I hope for other folks thinking about security and compliance and think how to do that in a DevOps-oriented way. I hope that was really valuable. If you want to hear more talks like this, I encourage everyone to check out rookout.com and lightstep.com. We have a bunch of talks there on various topics, from specific things around production systems to all kinds of other issues related to DevOps and developing software today. As I said, today's talk was recorded. Everyone who registered will be getting a link so you can watch it on your own time, share it with colleagues. And yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in and for your attention. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, guys.